I never thought I'd be the guy telling a story like this. My name's Adam, and I've been married to Karen for 12 years. We met in college. She was the type of woman who turned heads everywhere she went, full of life and always the center of attention. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but I always believed we had something solid. We built a life together, bought a house, and had 2 kids. Life was good. At least, that's what I thought. Lately, though, something had started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but Karen had been acting distant. She used to be glued to her phone, always texting or scrolling through social media, but now she would disappear with it for hours, only to return with some vague excuse about needing me time. I didn't think much of it. After all, everyone needs a break. But then she started going out more, saying she was meeting up with friends or running errands, but she'd be gone for hours. When she came back, she seemed distracted, lost in her own world, like she was miles away even when she was sitting right next to me. It wasn't just her absence that bothered me, though. Our sex life had gone from passionate to practically non-existent in what felt like the blink of an eye. We used to be all over each other, couldn't keep our hands to ourselves, but now? Now, I was lucky if she even acknowledged me when I climbed into bed. I tried to initiate things, but she'd always come up with some excuse: tired, stressed, not in the mood. It's funny how quickly the things you don't notice can become glaringly obvious when you're already on edge. I started paying attention to the little details, the things that didn't add up. I guess that's where it all started: the doubt, the suspicion, the gnawing feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. I'd catch her smiling at her phone, typing away with a grin that she hadn't flashed at me in months. Or she'd come home late, hair a mess, makeup slightly smudged, and give me some bullshit story about traffic or a late meeting. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But the more I tried to push those thoughts away, the stronger they became. So, I started snooping. I know it's not something a husband should do, but I couldn't help it. I needed to know what was going on, why Karen was pulling away from me. I went through her phone while she was in the shower, checked her messages, her emails. At first, I didn't find anything. She was careful, I'll give her that. But then, one day, I stumbled upon something that shook me to my core. It was a text conversation with a guy named Steve, a name I didn't recognize. The messages were innocent at first, just friendly banter. But as I scrolled back through the chat history, I saw it, a string of messages that left no doubt in my mind about what was going on. "Can't wait to see you tonight," she'd written. "I've been thinking about you all day." I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking as I scrolled further. The messages got more explicit, more detailed, until there was no question about what had been happening behind my back. My wife was cheating on me, and it wasn't just some one-off fling. This had been going on for months, right under my nose. I didn't confront her right away. I didn't know how to. I needed time to process what I'd found, to figure out what I was going to do. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but another part of me was too numb to feel anything at all. How could she do this to me? To us? To our kids? I went about my days in a daze, barely functioning, pretending everything was normal when inside, I was dying. Every time I looked at her, I saw the betrayal, the lies, the deceit. I couldn't touch her, couldn't kiss her, couldn't even look her in the eyes without wanting to throw up. But I couldn't let her know that I knew. Not yet. I needed to be sure. I needed proof. So, I waited. I watched. And as the days turned into weeks, I gathered the evidence I needed to confront her. And when I finally did, it was going to be one hell of a confrontation. It was a Friday afternoon when I decided to take the kids to my grandmother's house for the weekend. Karen had told me she needed some time alone to catch up on work and relax, so I figured it was a good excuse to give her some space. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. The thought of what she might be up to gnawed at me the entire drive, but I pushed it aside, trying to focus on the kids. My grandmother lives about an hour away, so it wasn't a long drive. The kids love visiting her, she spoils them rotten, and they always have a blast. I dropped them off, made some small talk with Grandma, and then headed back home. But as I drove back, a pit formed in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I got home earlier than Karen expected. I had originally planned to stay at my grandmother's for the night, but something told me I needed to get back. I needed to know what was happening when I wasn't there. The house was eerily quiet when I pulled into the driveway. Karen's car was parked out front, but there were no other signs of life. I let myself in quietly, my heart racing. The living room was empty, the lights were off, but I could hear faint noises coming from upstairs. My pulse quickened as I slowly made my way up the stairs, the sound becoming clearer with each step. It was a mix of grunts, moans, and laughter, male laughter. When I reached the top of the stairs, the noises were unmistakable. They were coming from our bedroom. Our bedroom. I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I could hear Karen's voice now, loud and clear. She was screaming, not in pain, but in pleasure. "Finish it. He'll be here in 10 minutes. My blood ran cold. My mind was spinning as I realized what was happening on the other side of that door. Karen wasn't alone. And she wasn't just with one man. I pushed the door open without hesitation, the sight before me confirming my worst nightmare. There she was, my wife of 12 years, naked and spread out on our bed, surrounded by 4 men. All of them were in various states of undress, their hands and bodies all over her. And Karen, she looked like she was in heaven. Her head was thrown back, eyes closed, her mouth open as she moaned and begged for more. The room reeked of sweat, sex, and betrayal. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. I felt like I was in some sort of twisted nightmare, like none of this could possibly be real. But it was real. It was happening right in front of me. One of the men noticed me first. He froze, his eyes wide with shock as he scrambled to pull away from Karen. The others followed suit, panic spreading through the room as they realized they'd been caught. But Karen, she didn't stop. She didn't even open her eyes. She just kept moaning, kept begging them to finish. I stood there, numb, watching as the reality of the situation sank in. My wife, the mother of my children, was being fucked by 4 strangers in our bed. The bed we had shared for years, the bed where we had made love, laughed, and comforted each other. And she was doing it with a sick smile on her face, like she didn't have a care in the world. Finally, Karen opened her eyes, and when she saw me standing there, her expression didn't change. There was no guilt, no shame, just a lazy, satisfied smile. "You're early," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I wasn't expecting you until later." "What the fuck is this?" I managed to choke out, my voice shaking with rage and disbelief. Karen shrugged as if what she was doing was the most normal thing in the world. "You're always gone. I needed something more, something exciting. And these guys, they know how to give it to me." The men were scrambling to get dressed, trying to slip past me without making eye contact. But I didn't care about them. My focus was entirely on Karen, on the woman who had just torn my world apart. "You fucking bitch," I spat, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "How long? How fucking long has this been going on?" Karen just laughed, a cold, cruel sound that sent chills down my spine. "Does it matter? I've been fucking around for years, Adam. You were just too blind to see it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I thought I loved, was a stranger. The Karen I married would never do something like this. But this wasn't the Karen I married. This was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But there was no making sense of it. My wife was a whore, and she didn't even have the decency to hide it. "Get the fuck out of my house," I growled at the men, my fists clenched at my sides. "Now. They didn't need to be told twice. They bolted, leaving their clothes and belongings behind as they fled down the stairs and out the door. But Karen didn't move. She just lay there, her body exposed, a smirk on her face as she watched me with cold, calculating eyes. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. "Are you going to throw me out too?" I didn't have an answer for her. All I could think about was how badly I wanted to hurt her, to make her feel a fraction of the pain she had caused me. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't even look at her. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, out of the house. I needed to get out of there before I did something I'd regret. As I drove away, my mind was a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and despair. The image of Karen with those men burned into my brain, a scar that would never heal. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do next. All I knew was that my life as I knew it was over. Karen had destroyed everything, and now, it was time for me to figure out how to pick up the pieces. I spent the next few hours driving aimlessly, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. I couldn't get the image of Karen, naked and moaning, surrounded by those men, out of my head. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing, and all I could think about was how much I wanted to make her pay for what she'd done. Eventually, I ended up at a secluded park on the outskirts of town. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside me. I was furious, devastated, betrayed, all at once. But underneath it all, there was something else, something darker. A part of me wanted revenge, wanted to hurt Karen as much as she had hurt me. But I wasn't sure how far I was willing to go. As the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. I had to go back and confront her. I needed answers, and I needed to understand why the woman I loved had turned into a monster. With a deep breath, I started the car and headed home, the knot in my stomach tightening with each passing mile. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. The men were long gone, and the only sign of life was the faint glow of the living room light shining through the curtains. My hands were shaking as I stepped out of the car and made my way to the front door, the weight of what I was about to face pressing down on me like a heavy stone. I opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. The house felt different, colder, like the warmth and love that had once filled it had been sucked out, leaving only a hollow shell. Karen was sitting on the couch, dressed in a robe, her hair damp from a shower. She didn't look up when I walked in, just sat there staring at the floor with a blank expression. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her, trying to make sense of everything. But there was no making sense of it. The woman sitting in front of me was a stranger. The Karen I knew, the woman I had loved for over a decade, was gone. Replaced by someone cruel, selfish, and utterly heartless. "You have no idea how much I want to fucking kill you right now," I said, my voice low and shaking with rage. Karen didn't flinch, didn't even look up. She just sighed and shook her head as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Adam, stop being so dramatic. You knew things weren't great between us." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my temper in check. "That's not an excuse to fuck for men in our bed. In our fucking bed, Karen." Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes cold and unfeeling. "I needed something more. You haven't exactly been Prince Charming lately, you know. Always working, always stressed. I'm a woman, Adam. I have needs." "Needs?" I spat, incredulous. "And you thought fucking a bunch of strangers in our home was the answer? You're unbelievable." She rolled her eyes, that same smug smirk playing on her lips. "You're the one who's been neglecting me. You're the one who didn't notice when I started pulling away. You didn't even care." "Neglecting you?" I took a step closer, the anger boiling over. "I've been breaking my back to make sure we have a good life. I've been working my ass off to provide for you and the kids while you've been, what? Screwing around behind my back? You don't get it," she snapped, her voice rising. "You were never here, Adam. You might as well have been a ghost. I was lonely, and they made me feel alive again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They? I echoed, disgusted. How many, Karen? How many men have there been? She shrugged as if it didn't matter. Does it matter? What difference does it make? It's not like you were interested. That was it. The final straw. The anger I had been trying so hard to control finally broke free, and I lunged at her, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her hard. You fucking bitch. You've destroyed everything. She didn't fight back, just stared at me with that same blank expression, like none of this mattered to her. Adam, calm down. You're not going to hurt me, she said calmly, almost tauntingly. I froze, my hands still gripping her shoulders. She was right. No matter how much I wanted to hurt her, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I let go of her and stepped back, disgusted with myself, with her, with everything. You're fucking sick, I muttered, turning away from her. You're not the woman I married. You're not even human. She stood up, tying her robe tighter around herself. Maybe I'm not. But you're not blameless in this, Adam. You were never here for me. You pushed me away, and I found comfort where I could. You can hate me all you want, but it doesn't change the fact that you abandoned me first. I stared at her, trying to comprehend the twisted logic she was using to justify her actions. But it was pointless. There was no reasoning with her, no salvaging what we had. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Get out, I said finally, my voice hoarse. I want you out of this house by tomorrow. I don't care where you go, but I don't want to see you here when I wake up. She didn't argue, didn't plead for forgiveness. She just nodded, as if she had been expecting this. Fine. But I'm taking the kids. That stopped me cold. The kids? I repeated, my heart sinking. You think I'm going to let you drag them into this mess? They need their mother, she said, her tone dismissive. And after what you've just done, you're in no position to fight me on this. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, the thought of losing my kids overwhelming me. You're not taking them, Karen, I said, my voice shaking with desperation. I won't let you. She just smirked. We'll see about that. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, shattered and alone. The realization that I had not only lost my wife but could also lose my children hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew I needed to act fast, to protect them from the toxic mess that Karen had created. But in that moment, all I could do was collapse onto the couch, my head in my hands, and let the tears I had been holding back finally flow. The woman I had once loved more than anything had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now she was threatening to take away the only thing that mattered to me anymore, my kids. The rage and heartbreak I felt were consuming me, but I knew I couldn't let them control me. I had to be smart, I had to be strong, and most of all, I had to make sure Karen didn't get away with this. As I sat there in the dark, the weight of everything crashing down on me, one thing became clear: I was going to fight her. I was going to make sure she paid for what she had done. And I wasn't going to let her take my children without a battle. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The numbness had worn off, replaced by a burning determination. Karen had destroyed our marriage, shattered our family, and now she was planning to take my children away. There was no way in hell I was going to let that happen. She wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could play dirtier. First, I needed to make sure she knew just how serious I was. As much as I wanted to throw her out of the house immediately, I had to be strategic. I needed to dismantle her life piece by piece, make her feel every ounce of pain she had caused me. I wanted her to suffer, to regret every choice she'd made that led her to this point. And I knew just how to do it. I started by taking control of the finances. Karen had always been careless with money, letting me handle the bills and expenses while she spent whatever she wanted on herself. She never paid attention to the accounts, never bothered to check the statements. That was about to change. That morning, while Karen was still asleep, I went into our shared online banking account and transferred the majority of the money from our joint account into an account in my name only. I left just enough for her to cover the basics, barely. She would have access to it, but it wouldn't be enough for her to live comfortably. She'd have to scrape by, and that was exactly what I wanted. Next, I went through her closet and found every expensive piece of jewelry I had ever bought her, gifts for anniversaries, birthdays, Christmas. They were all going to be sold. I knew a guy who dealt in high-end jewelry, and I planned to take it all to him later that day. Karen loved those pieces, she loved showing them off, loved the attention they brought her. Selling them off was just the beginning of taking everything she cherished away from her. With the money situation handled, I moved on to her social life. Karen thrived on her social status, her friends, her little gatherings, the illusion of being the perfect wife and mother. But now, I was going to expose her for what she really was. I started by gathering all the evidence I had collected over the past few weeks, text messages, photos, anything that proved her infidelity. I put it all together in a neatly organized file and began sending it to her closest friends. The women she gossiped with, the ones who looked up to her, who thought she had the perfect life. I made sure they knew the truth. I even sent copies to her family, letting them know exactly what kind of daughter they had raised. It didn't take long for the phone calls and messages to start flooding in. At first, Karen was confused, then furious. She stormed into the living room where I was calmly sipping my coffee, her face red with anger. "What the fuck did you do?" she screamed, holding up her phone. "You're ruining my life, Adam. You have no right." I looked at her, my expression cold and detached. "I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth about you, Karen. You wanted to destroy our family? Fine. But you don't get to walk away unscathed. You're such a fucking asshole," she spat, her voice shaking with rage. "You think you can just do this to me?" "I'm not doing anything to you that you didn't bring on yourself," I replied calmly. "You made your choices, Karen. Now you get to live with the consequences." She glared at me, her hands clenched into fists. "You think you're so smart. But you're not going to win this. I'll make sure of it." I stood up, towering over her, my voice low and menacing. "I've already won. And this is just the beginning." I could see the fear flicker in her eyes as she realized just how serious I was. She backed down, turning away from me, but I could tell she was plotting something. It didn't matter. Whatever she tried, I was already 10 steps ahead. Over the next few days, I watched as Karen's life began to crumble. Her friends started distancing themselves, whispering behind her back, treating her like a pariah. The social media posts she was so proud of began to disappear as she desperately tried to maintain her image, but the damage was already done. Her reputation was in tatters, and she had no one to blame but herself. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Karen worked at a local boutique, a place she loved because it allowed her to play the role of the fashionable, sophisticated woman she pretended to be. She had always bragged about how much the owner adored her, how she was practically irreplaceable. I knew better. I also knew the owner was old-fashioned, with strong opinions about family values and fidelity. So, I paid him a visit. I showed up at the boutique one afternoon, dressed in my best suit, looking every bit the concerned husband. The owner, Mr. Henderson, welcomed me warmly, surprised but pleased to see me. We exchanged pleasantries before I got to the point. "Mr. Henderson," I began, my voice steady. "I'm afraid there's something you should know about Karen. It's not easy for me to say this, but I think it's important you hear it from me rather than rumors." His expression turned serious, and he invited me to sit down. I took out the file I had prepared, the same one I had sent to Karen's friends and family, and handed it to him. He looked at it, then back at me, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "What is this?" he asked, his voice cautious. "It's evidence," I replied. "Of Karen's infidelity. She's been carrying on with multiple men behind my back. I've done everything I can to protect our family, but she's determined to destroy it. I thought you should know, given your values and the fact that she represents your business." Mr. Henderson's face darkened as he flipped through the file, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't say much, just nodded as he absorbed the information. I could see the wheels turning in his head, could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about Karen. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Adam," he said finally, closing the file. "This is disturbing. I'll have to think about how to handle this." I nodded, knowing I had planted the seed. I didn't need to say anything more. The damage was done. The next day, Karen came home in tears. She had been fired. Mr. Henderson had let her go, citing moral concerns and damage to the boutique's reputation. She was devastated, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. "You did this," she accused, her voice breaking. "You've ruined everything." I didn't deny it. "I warned you, Karen. You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it. How could you be so cruel?" she sobbed, collapsing onto the couch. "I loved that job. I loved my life. Why are you doing this to me? You think I'm being cruel?" I asked, my voice cold. "What do you think it was when you were fucking other men in our bed? When you decided to destroy our family because you were bored? You don't get to play the victim here, Karen." She didn't respond, just buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her, my heart hardened against her tears. There was no pity left in me, no sympathy. She had made her choices, and now she was paying the price. As the days turned into weeks, Karen's life continued to unravel. She struggled to find another job, her social circle shrank to almost nothing, and the luxurious lifestyle she had taken for granted began to slip away. She was forced to sell off her designer clothes, her handbags, the things she had once flaunted as symbols of her success. Every time she lost something, I felt a grim satisfaction. This was the woman who had torn my life apart, and now she was getting exactly what she deserved. But even as I watched her crumble, I knew this was just the beginning. There was still more I could do, still more ways to make her life a living hell. She had thought she could get away with betraying me, with destroying everything we had built together. But she was wrong. While Karen's life was crumbling before her eyes, I knew I wasn't done. The men who had been with her, who had disrespected me and my family, weren't going to walk away unscathed. They had no idea what kind of firestorm they were about to face. I wasn't going to let them get away with what they'd done, not without feeling the consequences. The first step was finding out who they were. Karen hadn't exactly been discreet with her phone, and I'd already gathered some information on them from the texts and calls I'd seen. I spent a few days doing some digging, finding out everything I could about these four assholes. It didn't take long to get the details I needed: names, workplaces, addresses, even social media profiles. They all had something to lose, and I was going to make sure they lost it. The first guy, Jason, was a real piece of work. He was a gym trainer, one of those self-obsessed meatheads who lived for flexing in the mirror and posting shirtless selfies online. He prided himself on being a ladies' man, and I knew just how to hit him where it hurt. I created a fake account on Instagram, pretending to be a woman who was interested in his services. It wasn't hard to get him talking. Jason had a habit of bragging about his conquests, and before long, he was spilling all the details about his encounters with married women, including Karen. I recorded our conversations and made sure to capture every dirty little detail he shared. Then, I compiled everything into a neat little package and sent it off to the owner of the gym where Jason worked. The owner was an old-school guy, someone who valued integrity and professionalism. He didn't take too kindly to the idea of one of his trainers screwing around with clients, especially married ones. Within a week, Jason was out of a job. I heard through the grapevine that his reputation in the local fitness community was trashed, and he was struggling to find work anywhere in the area. The second guy, Matt, was a bit more of a challenge. He was a mid-level manager at a tech company, married with kids. A real family man, on the surface, at least. I found his wife on Facebook, a sweet woman who posted pictures of their kids, their family vacations, all the while completely unaware that her husband was screwing around behind her back. It was time she knew the truth. I sent her an anonymous package, filled with all the evidence I had gathered about Matt's affair with Karen. Photos, text messages, the works. I made sure it was undeniable, something she couldn't ignore. It didn't take long for the fallout to hit. A few days after I sent the package, I got a message from a mutual acquaintance, someone who knew both Matt and his wife. Apparently, she had confronted him with the evidence, and things had gotten ugly. There were rumors that she was filing for divorce, that she was going to take him for everything he had. Matt was about to learn just how expensive infidelity could be. The third guy, Ryan, was a small-time real estate agent, the kind of sleaze who would do anything to close a deal. He had a reputation for being a bit shady, cutting corners and bending the rules to get what he wanted. I figured it was time his clients knew what kind of man they were dealing with. I made some anonymous phone calls to the local real estate board, dropping hints about Ryan's unethical behavior, suggesting they look into his recent transactions. I also contacted a few of his clients, posing as a concerned citizen who had heard rumors about his unprofessional conduct. Word started to spread, and before long, Ryan was under investigation. His clients began pulling out of deals, his reputation tanked, and he started losing business left and right. It wasn't long before he was struggling to keep his head above water. The last guy, Steve, was the one who had really gotten under my skin. He was the ringleader of the group, the one who had organized their little rendezvous with Karen. He worked as a bartender at a popular local bar, a smooth talker who thought he was God's gift to women. I decided to make his life a little more complicated. I started by spreading rumors about him at the bar where he worked. I made a few anonymous calls to his boss, claiming that Steve was dealing drugs out of the bar, that he was stealing from the register, anything that would raise suspicion. I knew the owner was a paranoid type, always worried about the cops or losing his liquor license. It didn't take much to get Steve fired. Once he was out of a job, I took it a step further. I started posting anonymous reviews online, trashing the bar and hinting that Steve had been involved in some pretty shady dealings. The bar's reputation took a hit, and they lost a lot of business because of it. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to see Steve squirm, to see him lose everything. I found out where he lived, a cheap apartment on the other side of town. I made a few calls, posing as an old friend, and got his landlord's contact information. Then, I started leaving anonymous tips, claiming that Steve was dealing drugs out of his apartment, that he was hosting wild parties, anything that would make him a target. The landlord wasn't interested in dealing with any potential trouble and evicted Steve within a month. The last I heard, he was couch surfing with some of his less than reputable friends, barely getting by. One by one, I watched as each of these men's lives unraveled, as they faced the consequences of their actions. It wasn't enough to just ruin their professional lives, I wanted them to feel the pain, the humiliation, the despair that I had felt when I walked in on them with my wife. They had taken something from me, something I could never get back, and I wasn't going to let them walk away without paying for it. Karen, of course, had no idea what I was up to. She was too busy dealing with her own crumbling life to notice what was happening to the men she had been screwing around with. And that was fine by me. She didn't need to know. All that mattered was that they were all suffering, that they were all paying the price for their betrayal. But even as I watched them fall, even as I reveled in their misery, there was still a part of me that felt hollow. I had gotten my revenge, sure, but it didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase the betrayal, the pain, the humiliation. It didn't make things right. It just made things different. With Karen's life in shambles and her lovers dealt with, it was time to turn my attention to the final piece of the puzzle, the kids and the property. I knew Karen was still under the delusion that she could somehow keep everything, including custody of our children, despite the mess she had made. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I had played the long game, gathering evidence, taking my time to ensure everything was airtight. Now, it was time to make my move. I contacted the best family law attorney in town, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who had a reputation for being ruthless in court. When I laid out the details of my case, showed her the evidence I had compiled, everything from the text messages, photos, and recordings to the statements from witnesses, she nodded, her face set in a determined expression. "This is solid," she said, flipping through the stack of documents I'd brought her. "With this, we can make sure you get full custody of the children, and she'll be lucky to walk away with anything more than the clothes on her back." That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Patricia and I spent the next few weeks preparing the lawsuit. We worked out every detail, every angle, making sure there was no room for Karen to wriggle out of this. I was going to take everything: our home, the savings, the investments, the custody of our children. I wasn't just going for a divorce, I was going for total victory. When the lawsuit was finally ready, Patricia filed it with the court. I knew Karen would be served the papers soon, and I couldn't wait to see her reaction. But first, there was one last conversation that needed to happen, one final confrontation before everything blew up. I waited until the kids were asleep that night before I sat Karen down in the living room. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy from crying, her once vibrant face now pale and drawn. The past few weeks had taken a toll on her, and she was a shadow of the woman she used to be. But I didn't feel any pity for her. Not anymore. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm, almost cold. She looked at me warily, as if she could sense that something was coming. "About what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what happens next," I replied. "About the kids. The house. Everything." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Adam, I know things have been bad, but can't we try to work this out? For the kids' sake? Work this out?" I scoffed, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You destroyed our family, Karen. You threw everything away. There's nothing left to work out." "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm still their mother. You can't just take them away from me." "Watch me," I said, my tone hard. "I've already filed for full custody, Karen. I've got more than enough evidence to prove that you're unfit to raise them. You'll be lucky if you get supervised visitation after this is over." Her eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. "What?" I didn't flinch. "I've also filed for ownership of the house, the savings, and every other asset we have. You're not walking away from this with anything." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find the words. You can't do this, Adam. You can't take everything." "I can and I will," I said firmly. "You made your choices, Karen. You decided to cheat, to betray me, to destroy our family. Now you get to live with the consequences." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. "Please, Adam," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. Don't take the kids away from me. They're all I have left. You should have thought about that before you spread your legs for every guy who came along," I spat, the anger bubbling up again. "You should have thought about what it would do to them, to us." She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking as she covered her face with her hands. I watched her, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. This was what she deserved. This was what she had brought on herself. "Please," she choked out between sobs. "I'll do anything. Just let me keep the kids. They need their mother. They need a mother who cares about them," I said, my voice harsh. "Not someone who's too busy screwing around to be there for them." She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, and looked at me with desperation in her eyes. "What do you want from me?" I leaned forward, my gaze locked on hers. "I want you to understand that you've lost. You've lost everything because of your selfishness, your greed. I want you to know that you're going to be alone, with nothing, and no one to blame but yourself." She collapsed into the couch, sobbing harder, her body shaking with each breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered, over and over again. "I'm so sorry. But it was too late for apologies. Too late for regret. I had made up my mind, and there was no going back. "You'll be served the papers soon," I said, standing up and heading for the door. "You might want to start looking for a new place to live. This house won't be yours for much longer." I left her there, broken and weeping, knowing that I had finally taken control of the situation. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about securing a future for me and the kids, a future free from the toxic mess that Karen had created. As I walked upstairs to check on the kids, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. This was the end of our marriage, the end of everything we had built together, but it was also the beginning of something new. Something better. Something that Karen would never be a part of. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it, alone, with nothing but the ruins of the life she had destroyed. And I would make sure that she would never forget the price of her betrayal. The legal process unfolded like a carefully orchestrated plan. As soon as Karen was served with the lawsuit, everything started to move at a rapid pace. Patricia, my lawyer, was relentless. She filed motions, presented evidence, and built a rock-solid case that left no room for doubt. I was fighting for full custody of the kids, the house, and every significant asset we had. Karen, on the other hand, was left scrambling to find any way to hold on to the little that remained of her shattered life. The court hearings were intense, but I was prepared. Patricia had coached me on everything: what to say, how to present myself, how to maintain composure even when Karen tried to provoke me. I knew I had to stay calm, to focus on the end goal, securing a future for me and the kids, free from Karen's toxic influence. Karen's lawyer, on the other hand, was grasping at straws. They tried to paint a picture of her as a loving, devoted mother who had made a few mistakes but was still fit to raise the children. But the evidence I had gathered was overwhelming. The explicit texts, the photos, the detailed accounts of her infidelity, it all painted a very different picture of Karen, one that was impossible to ignore. In court, Karen looked like a shell of her former self. She was pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with despair. She tried to plead her case, tried to convince the judge that she deserved custody, that she could still be a good mother. But every word she said was undercut by the mountain of evidence against her. The judge could see through her lies, her attempts to manipulate the situation. I, on the other hand, remained composed. I presented my case clearly, highlighting how I had been the primary caregiver for the children, how I had always been there for them even as Karen spiraled out of control. I spoke about the environment I wanted to create for them, a stable, loving home where they could thrive without the chaos that Karen had brought into our lives. The judge took everything into account, and when the time came for the final ruling, I could feel the tension in the courtroom. Karen sat there, clutching a tissue, her hands trembling as she waited to hear the decision that would determine the rest of her life. Based on the evidence presented, the judge began, "It is clear that the best interests of the children must be prioritized. The court finds that the petitioner, Adam, has demonstrated that he is capable of providing a stable and supportive environment for the children. Therefore, full custody of the children is awarded to the petitioner." Karen let out a strangled sob, her face crumpling as the reality of the situation hit her. But the judge wasn't done. Additionally, the judge continued, "The petitioner shall retain ownership of the marital home and all jointly held assets. The respondent, Karen, will be granted limited supervised visitation rights, pending further evaluation. The court's primary concern is the welfare of the children, and as such, this arrangement will remain in place until a time when it is deemed appropriate to revisit the terms." It was a complete and utter victory. Karen had lost everything: the kids, the house, the financial security she had taken for granted. The judge's ruling was the final nail in the coffin of the life she had once known. I glanced over at her as the judge read the verdict, but there was no satisfaction in seeing her crumble. Just a cold, detached sense of finality. This was what had to be done, and it was done. After the hearing, Karen tried one last time to speak to me. She approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her voice barely a whisper. "Adam, please," she begged. "Don't take them away from me. I'll do anything. I'll get help, I'll change. Just, please don't take my babies. But I was done with her pleas, done with her empty promises. It's too late, Karen, I said, my voice flat. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. She reached out, as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back, putting more distance between us. I never wanted it to end like this, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Neither did I replied, the coldness in my voice matching the ice that had settled in my chest. But this is the end. There's nothing left to say. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, broken and defeated. I didn't look back. There was no point. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. And now, it was time for me to move on, to start rebuilding my life without her. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of changes. I moved back into the house with the kids, reclaiming the space that had once felt so tainted by Karen's betrayal. I focused on creating a stable, loving environment for the kids, doing everything I could to help them adjust to the new reality. They were resilient, stronger than I had expected, and with time, the pain of the past began to fade. Karen, on the other hand, spiraled further. She struggled to find work, to find a place to live, and her relationship with the kids became strained as they adjusted to life without her constant presence. The supervised visits were awkward, tense, with the kids clearly uncomfortable around her. They had seen the cracks in her facade, and it was something they couldn't unsee. As for me, I threw myself into my work, into parenting, into rebuilding my life from the ground up. The anger, the bitterness, the need for revenge, all of it began to fade as I focused on what truly mattered, my children, my future, and the chance to start over. The last conversation I had with Karen before she left town was brief, almost perfunctory. She had finally accepted that there was no going back, that our lives had irrevocably changed. I'm leaving, she said quietly, standing on the front porch, her suitcase at her feet. I need to start over somewhere else. I can't stay here. I nodded, feeling a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Take care of yourself, I said, surprising even myself with the sincerity of my words. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe understanding. But I had none left to give. Not anymore. Goodbye, Adam, she said finally, her voice breaking. I'm sorry for everything. Goodbye, Karen, I replied, and for the first time, I felt like I meant it. She turned and walked away, leaving behind the life she had destroyed. As I watched her go, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but it was something close to it. A weight had been lifted, a chapter had closed, and now it was time to move on. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I found a new rhythm, a new normal. The kids and I grew closer, stronger, and our home became a place of warmth and love once again. The scars of the past would always be there, but they were healing, and we were moving forward. In the end, I realized that life isn't about getting revenge or holding on to the past. It's about letting go, about finding the strength to rebuild, to start anew. Karen was gone, and with her, the pain and betrayal she had brought into our lives. Now, it was just me and the kids, and that was enough. More than enough. The storm had passed, and we had survived. And as I looked ahead to the future, I knew that whatever came next, we were ready for it. Together.